Welcome everybody to the session on the workforce development track. This is a session on called the evolution of incentives. What are employers doing to create excitement and action to recruit a workforce and retain the workforce? What are the companies doing, and how is it working? Essentially is the gist of the session here. If you joined us by mistake, meant to go to some other session, this is not like getting on the wrong airplane at the airport. We're not going to take you to Peoria instead of Hawaii. This will be a valuable session, even if you joined it by mistake. Let me introduce our panelists for a second, and I'll ask them to do a fuller introduction later on, as we call on them. But first, my name is Craig Jamolis. I'm the managing editor of the Gazette newspaper here in Cedar Rapids, and which means I run the daily operations of the newsroom here at our paper. Joining us as panelists today, we have three outstanding experts in this field. Peter Orzam is an ISU, Iowa State University professor. I believe, Peter, you've been there for 41 years, I believe.
That's right.
I've been a journalist for 41 years, but actually it's 6 or 7 different papers, not in one place. Peter is a economics professor. He blogs regularly on the labor market, and I'll have him introduce himself a little bit more later on. Jasmine Olmoyed, hopefully I said that somewhat correctly, is the Vice President for Continuing Education and Training Services at Kirkwood Community College here in Cedar Rapids. Formerly, she was the City of Cedar Rapids' first economic director before going to Kirkwood. And then Julie Moss is the state director for Iowa for the Society for Human Resources Management. She works closely with HR directors in companies throughout the state on a wide variety of issues, including workforce readiness, diversity, professional development, and many other things as well. So thank you all for being here and joining our panel today. There's one question I just want to start out with before we get into the nitty-gritty. We have a lot to unpack here today, and I think the hour will go fast, but I want to start with a question I think is on everybody's minds. This morning, the government released the latest inflation numbers, and we're way up there yet again. Year to date through September, 8.2% inflation, overall inflation, which is slightly better than last year or last month by 0.1%, but still higher than the Fed wanted, obviously. So I think this gives more ammunition for them to look at more interest rates and trying to slow down the economy the next time they meet. So before we get into the whole nitty-gritty of retention and bonuses and recruiting, from your perspective, despite all the storm clouds gathering on the economy, do you see our workforce or companies still in the mode, despite all this happening, or worry about what's going to happen in the future? Are they still in the recruiting and retention mode? They're not pulling back too much from your perspective, or are they?
I don't. From the perspective of the overall labor market and in Iowa as a whole, I mean, one of the reasons we have persistent inflation is we're about 3.4 million employees short of where we ought to be if you look at pre-pandemic trend growth in the labor market, and about 1.8 million of those are lost immigrants from pre-pandemic trends because the pandemic basically shut down cross-border traffic and labor. And 3.4 million people not producing stuff is with relatively strong consumer demand is what's fueling inflation. And absent solution on the labor market side, it's hard for me to believe that those inflationary pressures are going to abate without dramatically reducing demand for goods and services, and that's what the Fed is trying to do.
So, Jasmine and Julie, are you hearing the same thing from the people you talk to about they're still in the mode of trying to recruit workers? It's not like, hold on, we're going to step on the brakes here and we're going to just wait to see how things unfold, or is it still, trying to find workers to fill jobs?
I think
Yeah.
from,
Go ahead,
Julie.
Jasmine. Go ahead.
No, I guess from what I'm, nobody wants to follow the economist, right? Talking about the economy. I think that the currently in the market, it does seem like employers are still, searching for lots and lots of people across lots of different industries. I will say that the Iowa Works division, the community college side of that, it's a partnership with IWD, is part of my division. And in talking to our director, it does sound as if there are some companies that are starting to issue warn notices and starting to lay off. So I don't know if that is, part of just business cycles for them. At this point, I don't know that there's enough of them to where we would actually attribute it to what's happening in the economy, or if it has anything to do with what the Fed has done to interest rates. But certainly, I think that the idea is that they're trying to avoid a recession, but it's a delicate game that they're attempting to play at this point. And I think that once we do start to see layoffs occurring, that we can attribute to the fact that this is something that's larger than just kind of piecemeal from one company to the next. At that point, then we probably need to start considering whether or not this is something that we need to kind of gear up for. That said, with the labor market shortages that we have in Iowa, I feel like even, with a company here laying off 200 and a company here laying off 40, I still think that there's going to be a lot of demand in the workforce.
Julie, are you hearing more or less the same thing?
I am, and I think some of it's a little bit cyclical. During COVID, we first didn't need all of our workers, right, because things were shut down. And then when we wanted them back, it was a madhouse to try to get the workers that we needed. And we still haven't been able to go back to those staffing levels that we had pre-pandemic. And so we've had to take a look at our businesses to say, what can we do without? What can we run with? Reimagining our work. And I think what's happening is that people have said, okay, this might not have been an overly profitable business segment. And so, our choices are, and they're making those tough decisions within their businesses.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to address that off the bat because we have another round of bad inflation news today. And I know some company is going to look at this and say, I'm not sure what the future is going to hold. We're all in the same boat trying to look in the crystal ball. So far, the warn notices I've seen have been mostly from banks. Mortgage rates have gone up, and so they have less business for people writing mortgages. And I won't say that's all of them, but that's been, I think, the most pronounced so far. And whether that spreads, I think remains to be seen. So, Peter, I was going to have you first introduce yourself a little bit more than the top line introduction I gave at the start. But I wonder if you could give us a little snapshot of what the labor market looks like right now, particularly in Iowa, and what our participation rates have been, how many people are in the labor force, or how many dropped out compared to like national, what's going on there. And
well, sure. Let me go ahead and launch
there.
On that. Iowa has done relatively poorly compared to surrounding states and compared to the states that reopen their economies relatively soon following the initial surge of the pandemic. And if you look at where we've been relatively slow in recovering, it's with older Iowans. So older Iowans atypically were in the labor market pre-pandemic. They're still atypically in the labor market compared to other states, but it's the older workers that were the most likely to drop out of the labor market during the pandemic and not come back. So if you look at younger Iowans under 45, their labor force participation rates are actually higher than they were pre-pandemic. And so we don't have a lot of growth potential for new entrants into the labor market from younger Iowans. The remaining challenge is, can we attract some of the older Iowans back into the labor market? tax policies that make it more attractive not to work that Iowans passed recently is just going to exacerbate the problem that our labor force participation rates for Iowans over the age of 45 are down dramatically relative to the rest of the United States, and they don't seem to be recovering.
The one of the topics that has got a lot of attention is trying to beef up Iowa's labor force by trying to attract more people to move to the state, which is maybe a lofty ambition. I don't know how realistic that is, but I know immigration plays a role in this as well. I just kind of wonder, from your perspective, about how much of the billions of jobs that we need filled is going to come from people moving here from other states, or is it a more endemic problem of trying to convince people to come back to the workplace who left, or having more jobs that we want to attract legal immigration?
When I came to Iowa 41 years ago, I think Iowa had a program to try to attract people to move to the state. I don't know that that's been a very successful effort. Where we've managed to get increases is typically from immigration, particularly in certain sectors of the economy like non-durable goods manufacturing. And I think that that's the most likely way that we could rapidly replace the lost workers in Iowa is through immigration. And so it seems like we need to rethink some of our stance on immigration in the state, and perhaps try to rebuild the lost workforce in that way, particularly if the older Iowans that have dropped out of the labor market stay out of the labor market.
I do want to come back to this immigration thing a little bit more later in our session, but I want to move on. Julie, quickly, also, if you can introduce yourself a little bit more than I did in the top line. You just had or will have a statewide conference of human resources directors. I don't know if that has happened yet or is going to happen, but I just wonder if you can look at this from the standpoint of, okay, right now we don't have enough people in the workforce, but we have a lot of jobs. What are you hearing from companies about what they're trying to do to recruit people and get more applicants for the jobs they have open?
Sure. Thank you for that, Craig. We did, Iowa SHRM State Council does host an annual state conference. We just got done with that. We closed on Friday afternoon over in Coralville and had a great turnout. People were ready to get back out and mingle and network and do all of those things. And so it was a wonderful conference. But what we were hearing there is that people are just trying to reimagine what they've always done, right? Whether that's from how they recruit to what their applicant process looks like. From that recruiting standpoint, trying social media that they've never had before, all of those various avenues. So it's interesting to hear all of that. But they're also rethinking their hiring process. What does that look like? Does the application still look the same? Do I have to have a formal structured process, or can we expedite that? Because right now in the employees market, it's who can get them first. And so trying to get those people in faster and talk to them and get those offers out the door. And then from retention to just, I heard a lot about culture and trying to really bank on improving culture to retain employees. We've had to increase costs a lot from a wage structure standpoint over the last several months, and that's been difficult, especially for the smaller companies. And so really looking at what they can do internally with not adding to that foundational cost structure, things that can kind of ebb and flow a little bit more through culture initiatives. To really look at retaining and attracting, because that's important to candidates too, but retaining and attracting that workforce.
I see some of the things out there that our companies are doing to try to recruit applicants are, like I said, culture. I think that works on both retaining and retention as well, trying to improve their culture. And that could be anything from just how people get along in the office to things like food trucks every Wednesday or something like that. That is a perk. but it's now ingrained in the culture of the office. But we also see things like obviously pay, as a lot of pay has gone up a lot, which may have some inflation aspects to it as well. I think restaurant prices have actually gone up higher than grocery store prices, which are bad enough. But the one of the other, a couple of other things have been mentioned is flexible workforce. I think during the pandemic, a lot of people worked from home and found that there's a whole other life, that they can spend more time with their kids or their neighbors, and the TV is right here, or the refrigerator is a couple steps away. And I think people, friends of mine at least, have gone working from home. It's like they don't want to go back to the office ever again. And I just wonder if you're hearing more companies saying we're going to look at the flexible work arrangements, and maybe that's more of a permanent thing than just a pandemic kind of thing. I don't know if you're hearing that at all.
Certainly we are. I think flexibility has been a key driver throughout this thing. I think a lot of jobs that we didn't think could work from home can be done from home. And so that's been great for a lot of reasons. But I also think that companies are missing some of that value of having people together, and some of that collaboration, and those, just those conversations, water cooler conversations, if you will, that happen, or the meeting right after the meeting, and those things that just aren't organic conversations anymore. And it's more difficult to take the time to make those connections. And so flexibility is very important from both an employer and an employee standpoint. And I think we're at the point now where companies are trying to find out what that balance is. Do we really want them to stay at home full time? Do we want them in the office sometime? What's really needed for both the employee and employer?
And that obviously has an impact on the culture as well, whatever you decide to do. Are you hearing anything from HR directors about things that seem to be working to attract applicants? Or is it still a matter of people throwing 1,000 things against the wall and hoping something will stick?
I think it's still a little bit of the latter. We're trying really hard to figure that out, right? When you're in kind of a frenzy mode and we just need people and good people, you try a lot of things. And I don't know that we've had a lot of analysis yet on figuring out what exactly it was that we're bringing people there. But I am hearing from applicants that the culture piece is playing a big role. The wages are great. They have to be competitive, but people really want to work for a place where they can enjoy themselves, be home, and that flexibility piece is playing a big part.
I know that one of the examples that stuck out at me, I think it was last year, Applebee's, the restaurant, had a thing where even if you sign up to go in for an application, just an interview, no matter what you did, you would get a free appetizer.
Yeah.
And they had like double the number of people show up, applicants show up, but I don't think they actually hired a lot of people. People there, I think, for the free chicken wings, and not actually to work at Applebee's. So it was something that they tried, but I don't think it really worked all that well for them. And I think from what I hear is that the low-hanging fruit, like the pay, the benefits, have been addressed, or sort of addressed anyway. But the longer term things like culture, I mean, you don't turn on a dime and change your culture. That can be a very long term proposition.
Absolutely.
Jasmine, there's so much I want to talk to you about all this, but for this, on the recruiting side, it seems like there's a lot of attention, I think, statewide and nationwide. I think a lot of companies and cities are looking to their community colleges to say, help us get out of this mess. And in Kirkwood, I think that's somewhat the case here, and it has been for a long time, before the pandemic. But I just wonder if you could maybe just give us a little bit of maybe a top-line report of some of the programs you have going on that are trying to address the workforce shortage, or some of the things we see are, There's a truck driver shortage that was way before the pandemic started. We have a long-term nursing shortage, airline pilots. I think Kirk was involved in all those.
Mhm. We sure are, yeah. So as you mentioned, I am the Vice President of Continuing Education at Kirkwood. I oversee kind of all of the non-credit programming, a handful of credit programs like paramedic, which is another area where we see a large shortage across the state of Iowa. And prior to that, had spent about 8.5 years leading economic development for the city of Cedar Rapids, which certainly I think shaped the way that I see the local economy. So I think the way that I've kind of laid things out, or what my goal is for our division going forward, is to try and kind of address it. Actually kind of goes back to Dr. Orzum and Julie's comments. What I found kind of across the history of my career working in workforce now for about 15 years in our local economy is that when you're talking about people trying to recruit people to a local economy, it's generally going to be for higher paying jobs. And most companies don't oftentimes struggle to fill those unless it's something where it's just like a super niche position that they're trying to fill and you're doing a national search. But that, if you look at the ability of people to actually move across state lines to a position, that's actually a pretty small percentage of the US population. There's been some studies around it, and it's been years since I've seen the most recent one, so I'm probably quoting the wrong number, but at the last time I remember reading one from an economic development marketing firm, it was something like less than 10% of the US population actually have the resources to kind of move to take a position across state boundaries. So when you look at Iowa's economy, when you look at the jobs that we have available, it's not, we're not Silicon Valley. We're not hiring for jobs that are paying hundreds of thousands of dollars. And when you talk to employers, most of the time, the shortages that they're experiencing, you're talking about lower to middle skills types of jobs. So number one, you're not going to be able to find somebody who has the ability to move across state. It's expensive to move. You're talking about the first month's rent and paying to just get a U-Haul truck and everything else. And they generally don't have relocation benefits associated with service level jobs. So the state of Iowa, in conjunction with the community college system, has been looking at a handful of initiatives, I think, to try and mitigate some of those things in partnership with employers. One of the first things was Industry 4.0. That was something that was launched just over a year ago, and it's an initiative and an effort to try to encourage more employers to look at how they can use automation to solve some of their workforce shortages. So, is it a piece of equipment that could make it so that you don't have to have 4 people standing around doing a position? That comes with its own set of challenges, because obviously when you start talking about bringing in automated equipment, now you have a whole different skill set that you need that oftentimes these employers don't have the people on staff to be able to handle those things. So there's incentive programs through the state of Iowa to purchase equipment, to in partnership actually with Iowa State through CIRRUS to come and do assessments to try to help educate the employers on how to use these things. And then the community colleges obviously creating training programs to try and upskill those workers. There's also a lot of emphasis, and I think back to Peter's point on who is in the local economy that can take these types of positions. So the vast majority of even metro areas in the state of Iowa is not, they have diverse economies, but we're talking again about mid to lower skill level positions. I would say Des Moines is one of the more unique markets in the state in that there's a pretty strong industry cluster that is attractive to young professionals in finance. And so you do have the ability to move from one company to the next and kind of have a career trajectory. But even if you look at a place like Cedar Rapids, who has really a very long-standing, very strong economy, you're talking about more factory work. Food processing is a big industry for Cedar Rapids, but there's a number of other employers in a lot of different positions, but for every one sort of professional position, you're looking at, a multitude of, again, more like production workers, laborers, people who have to work out in a warehouse. So I think Peter's point is a good one in that we need to rely on who is going to come into our market. And we, I think, for decades enjoyed a steady stream of younger people coming in from more rural communities into the urban areas to take these types of roles. Well, that spigot has been drying up for decades now. And I think we're now at this crunch point where it's about what can you eliminate sort of the need for in terms of jobs through technologies, and then how do you take the available labor shed that you have to work with, whether that's skilling up workers within your own facility through training programs or on the job training or anything like that. And how are you working with people who maybe have barriers that would otherwise be participating in lower levels of employment, like at a Walmart, and train them so that way they can be a forklift operator or somebody who works in a warehouse. So Kirkwood's been creating, a number of certificates, very short-term training programs to try to get around that. But it does require a lot of employer assistance to do those types of things. And so that is sometimes challenging because some of the feedback is that I think there are employers who still maybe aren't ready to take that step necessarily in investing in folks who may have some additional challenges. We, just saw just last week, another program from the state of Iowa launched an additional incentive program around ESL, where employers, I think between now and December, early December, could receive assistance if they're willing to do on the job English as second language training programs. And we've done some of that. We have some resources for it, but they put another $5 million out there for employers. And so it'll be interesting to see what the response to that type of program is and whether or not employers are willing to make those types of investments and kind of taking chances on employees who are not maybe ready the moment they show up at the doorstep to do the job that they're hired for.
That was a question I was going to ask about these solutions that are out there to how we can maybe address the problem. Are they really solutions? And I just wanted to have you talk about that a little bit more about, I do think this English speaking is a major barrier for a lot of people that we are turning to immigrants to fill jobs. And they're not finding the time to have a regular English class. I know that's something you're dealing with fairly often.
Yeah, we've had a lot of success with companies who've been willing to kind of try it, to go out there, because you're absolutely right. There are a number of people in these metro areas who are driving out to meat processing facilities hour away because they're able to find employment with very limited English skills. But when you take a look at like what that situation looks like, you have someone spending maybe a couple of hours in a car and then, working an 8 or 10 hour shift. And then they have families, to deal with at home, and transportation becomes an issue if it's in the evening. So I think offering contextualized English classes is a way that employers really can get around that. And we've had some really great examples. Nordstrom is kind of the one that has risen to the top in terms of the last few years, but we've had other employers who have also participated. Whirlpool does some of that, and a handful of other employers where they're taking and hiring people who maybe don't have the level of English that they need, but they can find something else for them to do while on shift. So they go through an 8-hour shift, and 2 hours of that time is spent in, again, a contextualized English language program. We do testing for them on the front end to make sure they have at least some basic level of literacy, and that there's at least a common sort of functional level for the people in the class. So there's some pre-screening that's required. And that's one of the things that will be difficult, I think, with this new incentive program. If the companies can partner with Kirkwood, we can do the CASAS testing, make sure that the people are actually at the same level and start to receive that English training, because it does need to be intensive. No one's going to learn English 2 hours a week. So employers do have to make that commitment of, I'm going to pay someone to learn these skills, and it's not profitable for me to have people sitting in a class for 2 hours. But if I'm willing to make that investment on the front end, I've created now an employee who probably is going to have, a lot more commitment to my company. I've allowed them to make that change and still earn an income for their family. And it does help uplift the entire community if people can get into meaningful employment. So I would love to see more employers do that. We've also created some very specific types of classes. So like CNAs, you mentioned, big shortage in that field right now. And so we've been able to partner with organizations like Catherine McCauley and create, again, sort of these like contextualized English as a second language classes that will help get them like the basic healthcare foundational skills, and then they get into a CNA cohorted class together, so that way they can come out on the other end and do the job. So it's a lot of work. I'm not saying that it's not uncomplicated. It is very complicated, and it does take additional resources. But the state of Iowa has invested money into it. Kirkwood has dollars from the federal and state government. We've put some of our own money into it. And for employers who are interested in at least making that attempt, I think there's been good results. So it's something that I feel like maybe a lot of employers are not willing to put in that level quite yet. But with this extra constrained workforce that we have, I think that that is a reality that people will at some point have to begin to embrace, because you're not going to find people to work, there's a lot of $15 an hour jobs out there is what I'll say. And you can't really set yourself apart by having a foosball table in the break room. Like at some point, like there's only so much you can do. It's, at that level, it really is about people just trying to make an income to make their home life better. So,
we've speaking of nursing shortages, that the nursing shortage lasted, started way before the pandemic. The pandemic really exacerbated and put a focus on it and made it worse. We have a big package coming out this weekend in the Gazette about traveling nurses, how a lot of hospitals have turned to traveling nurses from other parts of the country who come here for a certain amount of time, and they get paid a lot more than the staff nurses do to fill these gaps. And they're expensive, drive up the cost of healthcare. We were all just kind of thinking the other day that a lot of them have gone to the University of Iowa here in Cedar Rapids and Iowa City. But the university is opening a new hospital in North Liberty. They're expanding their campus, hospital campus in Iowa City. And it makes you wonder, where are they going to find the nurses? And all the other things that, have to support a hospital, everything from janitors to sterilization workers to everything else. And I know that Kirkwood is chewing on this problem right now, trying to figure out, if this is where people want to go to be a nurse, what are the steps to get there and still earn an income while you're working toward that goal?
So we have entered into some partnerships with a number of the area hospitals and clinics where they're doing things like stipends to try to help, successfully get nursing students through. Because I think one of the biggest things that we see is, students who start something like the nursing program that requires, it's an academically rigorous class. The hours can be, when you start getting into like practicums and things of that nature, you really have to focus a lot of time and energy. So they're also trying to work full time, and that's become very difficult. So the hospitals have stepped up to really try to offset those issues by saying, look, we'll pay you a stipend, you work here 20 hours instead, and then go to school. So Mercy, St. Luke's, Unity Point Hospital, and then I think we just partnered with University of Iowa. But I think you also keyed in on one thing, and this is actually something, I'll plug the Gazette here. We're going to be having a conversation with one of our local hospitals, because you mentioned Central Sterile Tech, and that is something that, as we're talking with hospitals, people always think about healthcare from just the perspective of nursing. There's a whole pipeline into these types of occupations, but the problem is that there's so many other jobs that remain unfilled because people have no idea what they are. And so, when we were talking to the hospital, I'd said to them, we have a central sterilization program. It's a very short, I think it's like 8 weeks or something like that. Good occupation. There's tons of jobs available. They're having to pay much higher wages for people to come in from out of the community to do these positions. But it's not so much a marketing issue, because I can put that on TikTok to try to get to younger people or whatever it is, and they still are like, what the heck is that job? It's not something they're familiar with. So one of the things the Gazette's actually trying to help us with, it's kind of a Kirkwood partnership with the Gazette and the private sector to say, like, how do we get people aware of positions that they have never heard of? Because you shouldn't know dear God, if you're going to surgery and you've seen Central Sterile Tech, that's kind of concerning, because you probably shouldn't be awake at that point to see if somebody's like sterilizing the equipment. But we have these programs, so it's about making the connection from residents and from potential students, people who maybe are unhappy in their job. There's people, there's jobs at places like Collins Aerospace where you can make $28 an hour building radios. And when we ask them, well, what kind of level of skill are you looking for? They're like, oh, it's a high school education, and there is, well, what kind of people do you hire? And they tell us, well, hairstylists actually are really good at this kind of role because they have that attention to detail. But I can promise you, there's not a woman at Cost Cutters right now that's thinking she can go get a job building radios. It's just, this is kind of the issue too, that we have the training, we have the puzzle pieces, we have the ability to educate, and we have lots of resources to help people get education, sometimes completely for free. We have jobs available, but how do you plug people into these positions? Because everyone's heard of a nurse, but not everyone's heard of a central sterile tech. So So it's about educating people about the opportunities that exist in their backyard and letting them know they are qualified as well. But that's kind of the $64,000 question. So
Yeah, obviously there are a lot of opportunities out there. But one question, and maybe this is a question that Julie can address, and but others feel free to jump in as well. With all this need that companies face to fill their jobs and keep operating, are companies lowering their standards of who they hire? And I mean, we've seen the stories about restaurants now looking at high school students to be servers, and they didn't used to do that. We just had the legislature pass a daycare bill that let 16-year-olds mind children. And this is an odd thing, but pizza rollers, the people who made the dough or put it in the oven, they had to be a certain age beforehand, and now that age has been lowered. And so I don't know if are you seeing that from HR directors that, hey, we're rethinking who we actually fill these jobs with?
Yeah, I'd like to not think that we're lowering our standards. I'd like to think that we're reevaluating who can truly do the work, right? When we had people, I don't know that we've ever had people coming out of our ears, right? Iowa's always been our super tight labor economy, but I think we have had to relook and say, okay, what is it that we really need to do, or what skills we really need for those filling this job entry level, and then we can build the other skills on the job. To Jasmine's point, there's just a lot of people don't even know what's out there, right? And so what do we truly need? Try to recruit that skill set and then build them up along the way. And there's so many career paths out there for people who don't know. I loved Jasmine's just plug for healthcare. My paid job is HR manager for a hospital over in Ames. And that's where we're at right now too. It's okay, how do we get these people these transferable skills to know that they can come in and have a career in healthcare, because our hospital has a large opportunity for growth, right? And so, I don't want to say that we're lowering our standards, but we're certainly reevaluating what we really need from people to do the work.
Peter, which brings up a question here. If we're talking about transferable skills, like you're working at Cost Cutters, then you may go work at a hospital or the Collins Aerospace, something like that. How much of this recruiting going on is essentially grabbing other employees who already work in businesses, and then just are we just kind of in the same crowd, moving people around from jobs to jobs, or is it really making a difference in filling our vacancies? And Peter, you might have better insight into that.
Right. So, I mean, net hires is positive. So, but certainly quits have been a much larger share of job transitions during the pandemic, as people found out that wages were rising higher in other jobs, and so there was a lot more churning in the labor market than what was true in the past, because firms were desperate to find workers. And one of the best sources of workers is people who are already employed somewhere else. To Julie's point, when the labor market is really kind of loose, and you have a lot of people looking for jobs, there was a tendency for firms to just increase the number of requirements just to lower the number of applicants that they had to look at. And a lot of those job requirements weren't necessary, but it did winnow out the applicant pool. And now they're going in the opposite direction. So it's not necessarily lowering standards as it is removing some of the barriers to entry that you put in the past just to hold down the number of people who applied for work. I have not heard of many firms who are overwhelmed with too many applicants. And so, but certainly, and Iowa probably had, for early on in the pandemic, Iowa had the highest quit rates in the country. And that was people leaving jobs, not necessarily leaving the workforce, but leaving one job and moving to another job. And certainly that's started to slow down now. I noticed that quit rates are now sort of back to pre-pandemic levels. But for 2 years, the quit rates, not just in Iowa, but nationally, were much higher than they were elsewhere.
What are you, speaking of quit rates, and we've all heard about the Great Quit, where people, I guess they took their pandemic direct payments and their tax credits and other things that were meant to stimulate the economy, and they put them in the bank instead. And at some point they said, you know what, I don't want to work anymore. All this is just too much. I discovered another life working at home. And so they quit. But at some point that money has to run out, I would think. I mean, I'm kind of baffled by how people can quit and still pay their bills. But at some point that money's going to run out. Peter, have you seen any evidence that people are starting to come back to the workforce who dropped out, particularly in Iowa?
Not in huge numbers, but you do see. I mean, there was a recent survey that came out that found out that a lot of people who had quit during the pandemic are now reassessing. The problem you run into is if you quit at 45, you're quitting at the peak of your career earnings profile. And if that job is no longer there, a good share of the reason you were paid so much was you had experience at a particular firm and were atypically productive at that firm, but those skills are not transferable to your next job. So you're going to take a big haircut when you move to the next firm. So a lot of these people who are re-entering the labor market who dropped out between the ages of 45 and 55 at peak earnings are finding it extremely difficult to find a comparably paying job when they went back in. So it's clear that when they retired, they saw that their 401ks had risen 35% during 2020 and 2021, and inflation hadn't really taken off by that point. Now you're suddenly seeing people who we're in a bear market. I think the Dow was down 500 points this morning, or S&P 500 maybe. Anyway, I haven't. They're finding that their retirement wasn't what it was, and it's not going as far because the inflation rate is eating into it. So there is some evidence of people moving back in, but certainly not in sufficient numbers to replace the loss.
Make a difference.
Lost workers.
Interesting. There's two topics I want to talk about before our session ends. And these both get to the question of solutions and how well are the solutions, how true are the solutions. After George Floyd was killed and people took to the streets to talk about diversity and institutional racism, and a lot of companies, particularly in Iowa, or including Iowa, committed themselves to diversifying the workforce. And I just wonder from your perspective, and maybe Julie knows this best, and maybe Jasmine also, are companies still paying attention to that? Like a lot of companies said at the time, they wanted to do something on this, diversifying their culture. But at the same time, it seems like it's a free-for-all to fill jobs. And it's like, whoever comes in the door, if you qualify, you're it. I just wonder, has that been lost in all this mayhem going on right now, trying to fill jobs? Are people saying, you know what, that's important, but let's delay that? I just wonder what you're hearing or seeing out there.
Jasmine and I are looking at each other.
Yeah.
They certainly, it is still in the forefront. I think one of the things to just always keep in mind is, depending on where you live, your workforce is only so diverse, right? My organization's in Ames, and so we say we have a lot of Iowa State diversity because of that college there, but is the actual workforce outside of the college population as diverse? And so when you're looking at trying to increase your diversity numbers, it really depends, on the area in which you live. And to Peter's point before, every place is just a little different, and it really just depends. But I think where we see the conversations really going are, how are you making your employees feel welcomed and included within your own workspace? And again, going back to that culture piece, if people feel like it's a great place to work, hopefully more people will be attracted of all, diversity types.
Jasmine, are you seeing the same thing?
I mean, I think what I would say about the issue is that it's while it might not be at the forefront in terms of like the conversations employers are saying are our biggest challenge right now because of the fact that they're struggling so much to fill roles, in some ways, I think that it could actually help move the needle on actually getting that accomplished for one. So I think in times that are good, we talk about like what is DE&I, and a lot of times people say like, okay, well, we're going to do a training program. We're gonna send people to a luncheon. We're gonna do whatever that means. But right now, again, I keep kind of going back to what Dr. Orzum said earlier. It's when you actually get to a point where you have no other options but to start looking at, okay, well, what is the available workforce? And you can't pick and choose as much. I think by virtue of just kind of who is available labor force, and a lot of companies, it is causing it to become more diverse because you're starting to see people who are hiring, more immigrant population, maybe people who have historically had some criminal activity in their background, or people who have traditionally not participated in the workforce at specific types of companies. So it's kind of making the candidate pool, because I hate to, I guess, spoiler alert, because we haven't published it yet, but we have the skills report that we've done every year since the late 90s, or not, I'm sorry, not every year, every like 4 years. And we just got the results back. We're doing some additional work on the data side of it, just from the demographic standpoint. But one of the things employers did say is like, yeah, we've lowered our education requirements, experience levels. We're actually taking pieces away from jobs. So that way, maybe like if you didn't necessarily meet all the criteria, that's kind of like was already said, where we're kind of like lowering what the job itself is. So I think that because of that, there's going to be people who are entering into the workforce that maybe wouldn't have been at those types of companies before. One thing that's kind of concerning as somebody who is in education is that they're also starting to decrease the level of education requirements, which I think will also make a difference in terms of who we're seeing come into the labor force in specific types of companies that maybe, again, hadn't traditionally hired people that didn't meet a very kind of specific profile. So along with that, though, these companies do also need to really spend some time and energy on like, how do you retain people then who have a different set of expectations of an employer, or that are going to come with different sets of challenges. So we have seen companies who have focused on bringing in, for example, that English language learner population, having to also say, okay, we got to train our supervisors to make sure that they have a certain level of cultural competency. So to some extent, I feel like it's, even though it's maybe not as intentional as the conversations used to be around this topic at this very moment, I do think that it's actually naturally sort of starting to occur at these companies, because in order to meet production goals, you're kind of bringing in whoever you can, which comes along with a different sort of set of expectations then upon that company. So, so I feel like it's, maybe it's not as intentional of a conversation, but it might actually be moving the ball down the field a little bit farther, honestly. But this is a cyclical thing, and if depending on kind of how the economy turns around, to the point that's been made, purchasing power is not going to stay where it's at for a very long time. Most people don't actually, like, people are dipping into savings, I think, to pay on these like higher prices from companies for goods and services. And so at some point this will sort of start to decline, and we could see ourselves in another recession. And at that point, maybe some of these things that employers weren't thinking about right at this very moment are going to become very quickly overnight. It's going to change again. So I guess that'd be my cautionary tale to say you have to do both. You have to do the recruitment piece, but you do still have to focus on these other things. Otherwise, you're going to see yourself in a real bad position in a very quick time frame, I would say. It's kind of an overnight. So
yeah. Well, the other question that also I wanted to get to is that on the same theory of it's when times are good, it's easy to make promises. When times are bad, it's harder to keep them. A long time ago, I was at this Iowa, what was called the Workforce Future Ready policy that required, I think by 2025, which is right around the corner, that 70% of Iowa's workforce have a certificate or training beyond high school. And we were never really doing all that well in the first place. I think we're off by quite a ways. But is that still a thing that you're hearing people talk about? Or or has that been all lost in trying to fill jobs and say, well, we'll worry about that later. We're just not anywhere on meeting that goal. I don't know if that's in the topic of conversation these days of trying to move the needle on future workforce.
Well, earlier on, you asked something about, do we bring in a lot of people from out of state?
Right.
And the answer is Iowa has one of the highest shares of population born in the state of all the states. And generally you find that in the Midwest. And generally in the Midwest, we have exported human capital. So we educate people who go elsewhere. And pay tends to be higher. Of course, cost of living tends to be higher on the coast than it is in Iowa. And that's been a constant. So we still have trouble holding on to the people who we educate in the state. And yet, if you look at the fraction of college graduates in the state, they were atypically trained in the state. So we're sort of on both sides of this game, right? We work very hard to try to train people, and we don't work as hard to try to retain people. And I think that it's the retention part of keeping people in the state that we need to work harder at. But we need all kinds of workers, right? It's not that we are atypically have labor shortages at the advanced college degree level. We have labor shortages at all levels, and so I think it's time for Iowa to sort of look at where people have come from in the past and what our options are in terms of attracting people in the future. And I don't think that much of the policies that have been undertaken in the state over the last few years are actually realistically looking at where we are likely to find our future workforce.
We've been talking in the few minutes we have left here, we've been talking about mostly from companies and how they're addressing this. I want to take a minute to talk about from the employee's perspective. I might be entering the workforce for the very first time ever and looking for a job, or I might already be at a job and looking for something better that would pay better or meet my needs. Or I might be somebody who's dropped out of the workforce and now thinking one of the few people thinking about coming back to work again. Is there, and maybe this is a question for Jasmine and Julie in particular, from a prospective employee's standpoint, is there something that people should be doing to maximize their ability to find that job, or should they take whatever is offered to them, or is there something that people who are entering the workforce or in the workforce already looking for something else that they should be proactively doing to land that kind of dream job they have?
Do you want to go first, Julie?
If we go back to our other conversation about, what are we looking for to fill our jobs? I feel what I'm hearing from my colleagues in the HR world is that, we are way more open. It goes to the diversity conversation. It goes to the standards. I think we have expanded our search and we truly want the best person to fill our job, right? And so if, to Jasmine's point earlier, if we can get people to look at something, maybe not in their former, if you're talking all of those things, like if we talk a college student, I've got this degree, and does this degree mean this one type of job? No, it probably doesn't mean this one type of job unless it's a very niche degree. So I think for anybody, it's really expanding what they think might work for them, and doing some research. Lots of organizations out there, going back to your alma mater, if you have either from a community college or from a four-year college, the business offices are out there. And even if it's been a while, somebody's willing to talk to you and help you explore what's out there now, because the jobs have changed so much too in the last 5, 10, 15 years that I think the options are out there both for new grads and for returning workers or for those who just want to try something different. And I think it does take work up front to try to figure out what that might be, but there are so many resources out there and so many people really willing to look at a diverse set of candidates that we maybe wouldn't have in the past.
Desmond, do you have anything to add to that? We have a few minutes left here.
Yeah, so I guess what I would say, and I'm going to use this as an opportunity to plug a program that I feel like no one knows about. It kind of goes back to the Future Ready Iowa comment as well. So as part of Future Ready Iowa, one of the things that the state has done is they've created this program called the Last Dollar Scholarship Program. And what that Last Dollar Scholarship Program does is there are 36 different degree and diploma programs, credit programs that you can go into at a provider. So it's Kirkwood in our area, and it's any kind of career tech ed field. And so when people say career tech ed, I think instantly the mind jumps to like welding, and it does cover welding, absolutely. But really what career tech ed means is anything that's going to make you employable once you've completed the program. So it can cover things like nursing, it can cover things like business and IT, it can cover any number of different programs. And I think that's something that I truly don't think a lot of people know about. So you can go to school tuition free, it's all covered. It does not have to, it's not based on your income level. So City of Cedar Rapids actually has just supplemented with ARPA dollars, some like a last dollar as well to kind of help round it out for programs that maybe aren't covered. So in addition to that, there are tons of other resources that we have available to help people pay to get educated, to get a certificate, to get training. But certainly we're not the only ones. You know, you can go on to Google and you can get a credential from them and get a job that pays $80,000. There's so many opportunities out there. I think the problem is that people, because they don't have exposure necessarily to companies and what those companies offer, you only know the jobs that you're aware of, that you've been exposed to. And so I think this is kind of the challenge that we have, is like, how do you even get somebody who doesn't know the first thing about a specific industry or a specific type of job to even start the search to say, okay, well, that job is interesting to me, and what does it take to get me there? So that's an area, again, another plug for the Gazette, that I feel like, at least for those who are looking for kind of more localized jobs, that, you know, Indeed and all these other sort of job search boards, I think have kind of eaten the lunch of local papers, and people don't just look at the job section necessarily anymore. But I think that for local folks who are looking for kind of those lower to mid-level jobs, I would assume they're still going out to those pages, like to the Corridor Careers page or whatever. I'm not sure if it's even called Corridor Careers anymore. But that's where I feel like maybe this is an opportunity where we as a community can kind of work with, like, who are the providers of information to the community, and then who has the resources and who have the jobs, you know? So how do you link all those things together? And so I think if we get creative as local communities, we can start to solve some of those challenges, because I can find a way for somebody to get a credential. You know, the universities also have a lot of really great partnerships with community colleges. They have standalone programs. So there are resources out there to get people what they need to do jobs. It's just sometimes we're so, in some ways, so siloed and so over-resourced that I think that's where we've kind of lost our way.
I think too, though, as employers, we have an opportunity to really change the way we're advertising for our jobs and try to recruit for people to get the messages out better about the skills that we need, rather than focusing on the job titles.
Well, thank you all very much. Unfortunately, we're out of time. We could probably talk about this all day. But the Iowa Ideas continues the rest of today and tomorrow as well. And people who are joining us, look at the schedule, and there's all kinds of sessions to join and form networking relationships. And so I hope people will enjoy the rest of the conference today and tomorrow. I especially want to thank our panelists who took time out from their busy days to join us and talk about this issue that's facing Iowa right now. And I want to make a special shout out to our sponsor, IT Midwest. Anybody who lived through the Dre show knows when their lights came back on again, you really had to thank ITC, because they had tireless people out there rebuilding the grid, and so we could all enjoy life once again. And so I thank them for their continuing support of Iowa Ideas and helping Iowa become a better place. See you all later. And thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.